Hello, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to Masechet Moed Katan. Masechet Moed Katan is called Moed Katan because it's to distinguish it and to differentiate it from Seder Moed as a whole. But it also reflects something about the content of the Masechet, which is talking about Chol HaMoed. So in contrast to Masechet Beitza, which focused on the Chagim themselves, and in contrast to other Masechtot that we've already seen, like Masechet Rosh Hashanah or Masechet Sukkah, which focus on a specific Chag, Masechet Moed Katan talks about the halachot of Chol HaMoed as a whole, as they relate to each of the festivals, Sukkot and Pesach, where we have the intervening days between the two Chagim at the beginning and at the end of the Moed. And already in the Midrashei Halacha, in the Mechilta and the Sifra, the verse, Ele Moadei Hashem asher tikreu otam mikrei kodesh. So these are the festivals or the appointed days, which you will call sacred occasions, Mikrei Kodesh. This pasuk is adduced to learn about the laws of Chol HaMoed, that not just on the days, the first day and the seventh day of the Chag, you need to distinguish these days and turn them into a Mikrei Kodesh by wearing nicer clothes, by eating nicer meals, and also by conversely not performing melacha. So all of those rules are true not only of the first day of the Chag and the seventh day of Chag, but they're also true of the days in between, the days of Chol HaMoed, which are also considered to be Mikra Kodesh. However, what we see already from the very beginning of our Masechet is that even though you are not supposed to perform melacha throughout all the 7 days of Chag, including the days of Chol HaMoed, the Chachamim gave certain kudos, certain leniencies for the days of Chol HaMoed and distinguished them from the days of Chag. So we have the first and the seventh day of the Chag, which are a true Mikra Kodesh, and they're obviously very, very different from a day of Chol, from a regular day of the week. But as we see, the days that are in between that first day and the seventh day are not called Moed, they're called Chol HaMoed, right? So they're a kind of interesting mixture between a festival and a day of Chol, a secular day, a day which isn't a festival. So as we see in many, many places in rabbinic literature, the rabbis are very, very interested in that kind of Yetzur Kilayim, that kind of admixture of different elements. And that's a lot of what drives this Masechet. And so even though melachot are not supposed to be performed throughout the entire week, the rabbis gave certain leniencies which allowed all kinds of categories of melachot to be performed during the week of Chol HaMoed. So, for instance, the category which we'll discuss at length, especially in the second chapter, of Davar Ha'aved. So something, a melacha, that if it will not be performed specifically at this week during this time, there will be great financial loss. And therefore, the rabbis allowed for this melacha to be performed during the Moed. Or, on the other hand, melachot, which don't have a lot of torah, so they don't require too much effort and exertion, and so they can be performed even when preserving the special spirit of the holiday. So we see that even though the Masechet discusses at large, basically the main theme is that melachot should not be performed during Chol HaMoed, much of what is discussed is the exemptions to that rule. Okay, so if we look at the structure of the Masechet as a whole, we can see that the first Perek Mashkin, discusses those things which are forbidden on Chol HaMoed, whether it's because they are too similar to melachot that should not be performed, or whether it's things that distract too much from the simcha, from the joy of the festival. The second chapter, Mishafach, discusses those melachot that are permitted on Chol HaMoed because of Davar HaAved or because of various other reasons that will be discussed throughout this chapter. And chapter 3, chapter Elu Megalchin, discusses the laws of shaving and hair cutting on the Moed, as well as the laws of writing, which receive extensive treatment, at least in the Mishnah. However, here in this chapter, we're introduced to a subject which in the Talmud, both in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, ends up taking up a very significant portion of the Masechet. And this is the laws of mourning, Dinei Avelut, as well as the laws of Nidui, what we might call excommunication or a ban from the community, and the Sugiyot draw many, many parallels between those two categories. So this subject emerges already in the Mishnah. Interestingly, even though this is a Masechet that is discussing the laws of Chol HaMoed, we can see already from the very first chapter that there's an interest and a concern with the laws of mourning that occurs not only in the third chapter, which discusses it explicitly, but emerges from the very beginning of the Masechet. So for instance, chapter 1, Mishnah 5, discusses whether likut atzamot, the practice of a double burial that existed at the time of the Talmud, where the body would be buried, and then after a year, after the flesh had rotted away, then the bones would be collected and put into a common burial site together with the rest of the family. So the Mishnah there discusses, can this be performed during the Moed? Because it's not clear if the event of gathering these bones, likut atzamot, is something which is a day of mourning, or it's actually a day of rejoicing, of putting the body to rest. The next Mishnah, Mishnah 6 in chapter 1, discusses the difference between digging for a new kever, a new grave, and between using an existing grave during the Moed. Okay, so again, it's all in the context of the Moed, but we see that these laws that have to do with mourning and with death keep coming up again and again. Then the beginning of chapter 2, also the first two Mishnayot discuss what happens if you were about to engage in some kind of melacha, which is very, very time-consuming and lucrative, and then some kind of sudden event happens that derails your plans, so that you have to perform that melacha on the Moed, on the Chag. And the example that is given there is what happens if right before the Chag, you lost a parent, and therefore you were in mourning, you were in avelut, and you couldn't complete your melacha before the Chag, and therefore you had to do it during Chol HaMoed. So again, the context has to do with the Chag, but the examples have to do with the mourning. And finally, in chapter 3, we have a consecutive selection of 4 or 5 Mishnayot, which discuss the laws of mourning when they come into conflict with a Chag or with other celebratory days. So the issue that keeps coming up here throughout the Masechet in the Mishnah is mourning in the context of the Chag. What happens when they clash? On the one hand, the Moed is supposed to be a time of happiness, and on the other hand, mourning is a time of sadness. What happens when they collide and clash with one another? In the Talmud, in the 3rd chapter, this idea is taken much further, and the laws of mourning are discussed not only in the context of their collision with the Chag, with the Moed, but rather we see an extended discussion of Hilchot Avelut as a whole. And indeed, this is the main primary source for the laws of mourning as they continue to exist to this day. And within that discussion of Avelut, interestingly, we see a very, very clear distinction between two separate sugiyot, extended sugiyot, or two separate ways of approaching the subject of the laws of mourning. So first of all, from Daf Yud Daled until Daf Tet Zayin, so three folios of the Talmud, we have an extended and very, very organized sugiyah, which discusses not only the avel, not only the mourner, but also the menudeh and the metzorah. So the one who is excommunicated and the one who has leprosy. So obviously what all three of these people have in common, that they're all in some kind of state of mourning and exclusion from regular, normal, everyday society, okay? So the sugiyah there discusses the laws that apply to each of these categories and draws them together again and again and again. After that, from Daf Yud Zayin until basically the end of the Masechet, the sugiyah stops talking about the menudeh and the metzorah and discusses just the laws of Avelut as a whole. And creates in a way Masechet Avelut, right? The laws of mourning. We don't have a Masechet that discusses this issue, although it's possible that in earlier times there was a tractate like this, Evel Rabati, that was mostly lost. But we know that the Amoraim refer to this Masechet. But in terms of what the material that the Amoraim created, here we have an extended discussion of Avelut. And it's interesting that specifically in the Masechet that discusses Moed, discusses the Chagim, and talks about the importance of rejoicing, which we'll see also developed very much in the next Masechet, in Masechet Chagiga. We have precisely here the laws of mourning and the idea of this very, very sad time. And it's clear that the rabbis were well aware of this juxtaposition and created it intentionally. And in fact, around the middle of the Masechet on Daf Kaf, the Amoraim ask, from where do we know that Avelut should be 7 days? And they answer with the verse, they cite the verse, V'afachti chagichem le'evel. Okay, I will turn your festivals into a time of mourning. And they say, just as the Chag is 7 days, so too Avelut, the time of mourning, is also 7 days. So it's very clear that they're juxtaposing the Chag and the days of the Shiv'ah intentionally. And in fact, when we think about it, we can see that there's this juxtaposition highlights that there are many parallels between Avelut and between Chag, right? They're both 7 days. They're both days that are forbidden to perform melacha. So the isur of melacha that's discussed in the Masechet is not only relevant for the Moed, it's also relevant for the days of Avelut, as well as other prohibitions, like, for instance, the prohibition to have a haircut or to shave, or the prohibition to lay tefillin, okay? So there are many, many parallels between these different sets of 7 days, the 7 days of the festival and the 7 days of the Avelut. And the question is why? What is the meaning of these parallels? And in order to answer this question, I think that we need to go back to the sugya that I said draws parallels between the Avel, the Menudeh, and the Metzorah. And in fact, in that 3-page sugya, we can find 14 very, very, very organized cases where the Talmud draws parallels between these 3 categories. For example, it says, okay, we know that the Avel is forbidden to wear tefillin. From where do we learn that this is true for the Menudeh? From where do we learn that this is true for the Metzorah? We know that the Avel is forbidden to B'She'ilat Shalom. It's forbidden to be greeted and to greet other people. From where do we know that this is true for the Menudeh? From where do we know that this is true for the Metzorah? And the same thing for a series of other Isurim, like for instance, that all 3 of these figures are not allowed to engage in Torah learning and other prohibitions. But the very, very first parallel that is drawn in that case on Daf Yud Daled discusses the fact that all 3 of these categories are waived during the regel, right? So as you probably know, if a person started sitting Shiva right before one of the festivals, when that festival comes along, it cuts the Shiva short, right? And the same is true, says the Talmud, of the Menudeh and the Metzorah, that the festival waives the time that they are excluded from society. And what emerges from the proof texts that are brought in that discussion is that there's a contrast between these categories of the Avel, of the Menudeh, and the Metzorah, which are all, if you think about it, commandments or prohibitions that have to do with the individual person, right? If the Avel doesn't have any siblings, let's say, and he is sitting Shiva for one of his parents, then he is completely on his own in the Avelut. When someone is Menudeh, is excommunicated from the community, he's completely on his own. The Metzorah, the Torah really emphasizes that he needs to sit michutz lamachaneh, right? So he's completely on his own. He's very, very much isolated. And why are these commandments waived when they collide with the regel, with the Chag? Because the Chag is a time, it's an aseh derabim, okay? It's a mitzvah that is a communal mitzvah, a mitzvah that pertains to all of the community, and therefore it overrides those commandments that apply only to the individual person, the aseh deyachid. So what we see here is that the Talmud is pointing out to us very strongly, again and again, throughout all these parallels and throughout these juxtapositions, that there are many parallels between the 7 days of mourning and the 7 days of the festival. However, there's also a kind of a hierarchy between them. So when mourning collides with the regel, with the chag that has to do with the community, that obligation overrides the avilut. And I think that what the Talmud is doing by drawing together these discussions, and it's especially noticeable, I think, in the Masechet, in the Bavli, in contrast to the Mishnah and the Tosefta, because as I mentioned, the laws of Avilut start on Daf Yud Daled, so that's just the middle of this Masechet. So half the Masechet is dedicated to the festival, and half of the Masechet is dedicated to the Moed. And I think that what the Talmud is trying to draw our attention to through all these parallels and juxtapositions is that we're talking about diametrically opposite experiences. The Moed is about Simcha. That is the main commandment of the Chag, and particularly the time of Chol HaMoed, when you don't have a specific duty to bring a Korban Pesach or a specific duty to wave the lulav on the first day of the Chag, but rather the main point is to rejoice. And in contrast, the days of the Avilut, clearly the main point of these days is to be in mourning, to give space for one's grief. However, what is unique about Chol HaMoed and about Avilut, in contrast to the other Masechtot that we've already seen that talk about a specific day of the Chag? Just like we said at the beginning, Chol HaMoed is a mixture of a Moed and Chol. That means it's not a day, it's not a peak day like Rosh Hashanah or Leil HaSeder, where it's clear that we just have, a peak experience that is entirely different from the regular days of the year. Chol HaMoed is not like that, because on the one hand, it's a Moed, but on the other hand, there are things that you could do that are more similar to a regular day of Chol. And so the Talmud is telling us that particularly because it's this special Yetzur Kilayim, it's this special kind of mixture day, we need to pay special attention to the way that we construct through the halakha the experience of rejoicing. And the same is true for Avilut as well, right? If you are a person in mourning, everything else continues around you as usual. The world continues. There aren't other people who are engaged in the practices that you are engaged in. And so it could be easy to just, not have space for a person's grief and feelings, but rather for that to just kind of be dismissed in a way. And so the halakha is very, very, very particular about the space that it is creating through the halakha for a person to have time for the process of grief, right? And the Masechet talks about the distinction between the first day of the Avilut, the first 3 days of the Avilut, then the 7 days, the Shloshim, the 30 days, and the year. So there's certainly a process that is being built here. And so ultimately, I think that this division in the Masechet, which dedicates half of the Masechet to the Chag, to Chol HaMoed, and half of the Masechet to Avilut, is really putting together the point that the halakha not only reflects emotions and gives space for emotions, but actually constructs emotions. And so without the halachot of Chol HaMoed, we wouldn't really feel Chol HaMoed. There would either be days, festival days, or it would just feel like a day of Chol. And without the halachot of Avilut, we would not have space for the experience of Avilut. So it's not only that this is not reflecting an idea that, human emotions are just natural and, we just need to kind of give people time and space and they'll be able to experience their emotions. The Masechet is reflecting a different idea, which is saying sometimes you need the normative rules to give you the tools to really be able to experience your emotions. And so even though we're talking in the language of laws and regulations, which can sometimes seem dry and constricting, actually Masechet Moed Katan is focused on allowing people to experience the full range of human emotion.